most of all, arbitrary detention. So I ought to have introduced myself. I'm Joe. I'm the chair. Hello, Eric.
Hi, how are you today?
Doing well, thank you. Yeah. Thanks for joining us. I've just ended my introduction. I was just about to begin introducing speakers. And so, and introducing speakers in the order in which you might speak, but please do let me know if the order is inconvenient for whatever reason. First will be Abramo Emiliano, who's a member of the Commission for the Adjudication of Asylum Claims with the EU. After, Eric Davis, Professor of Political Sciences at Rutgers University. After Professor Davis, Dr. Nasser Al-Umari, excuse the pronunciation, who's a writer and political commentator and professor at City University in New York. After the doctor, Adam Shapiro, who's the Director of Advocacy for Israel-Palestine at Democracy for the Arab World Now, or DAWN, based in DC. And then finally, Abdullah Al-Aouda, who is the Research Director for Saudi and the UAE, also at DAWN. Each speaker, just to give an overview of the AOHR UK's usual webinar format, each speaker has between 15 and 20 minutes, leaving, we hope, a little time at the end for questions between speakers and perhaps from the floor too. Unless there's any questions, Professor Davis, if we go to you first, and we hope that Abramo can join us later.
Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and join the colloquium this afternoon on Saudi Arabia. I think that I'd like to give a kind of general overview to begin with. And the arguments I would make is that the Middle East, or the MENA region, is really at a crisis point at the moment. I think that we can start, first of all, with Saudi Arabia itself. I think that Mohammed bin Salman is not a particularly effective ruler. I think he's deviated from much of the consensus that's affected Saudi-US relations and Saudi Gulf state relations. And he is trying to create a new vision for Saudi Arabia, which will be one in which oil or petroleum wealth, hydrocarbon exports will not be as important as they were in the past. And certainly he's tried to achieve legitimacy among the younger generation, the up and coming generation, which I think he sees being part of that himself as the future of the country. And of course, we know that allowing men and women to have greater opportunity to go to restaurants and sporting events and other types of activities has earned him a lot of support. At the same time, we still have the legacy of the killing of Jamal Khashoggi. We have extensive human rights violations. And I think that's very disturbing because on the one hand, we know that many countries, including the West, are very dependent on Saudi oil. But at the same time, the international community cannot stand by, especially in the current climate where we see someone like Vladimir Putin consistently engaging in war crimes, torturing Ukrainians in a war of choice. There was no legitimacy for him to invade Ukraine. And also now using Iranian Shahed 136 rockets to destroy civilian infrastructure, which is, again, a war crime, according to the UN Charter. So in a world that we've seen a lot of democratic backsliding, we've seen a lot of authoritarian rulers feel that they have no constraints on their behavior. One thing that needs to be done is to create an international consensus that is going to say that Saudi Arabia obviously is an important member of the international community, but one individual, Mohammed bin Salman, cannot be in a position where he is able to treat the country as his playground, as his sandbox, and engage in activities which go against the norms, values, and even the laws of the international community. At the same time, we can see that this is highly problematic because the United States is dependent on support from Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states in its struggle with Iran, and that's conversely the case. The fact that the United States has supplied Saudi Arabia with extensive weaponry, as well as the Gulf states as bases in the region, and constantly lets the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia know that the United States will protect it from Iranian aggression. And we've seen such aggression, for example, the use of drones used by the Houthis in Yemen to attack Saudi oil facilities and airports. That we need also a strong alliance and consensus against the rogue activities of the Iranian regime. I myself do not see there being any imminent return to the JCPOA, in other words, the nuclear agreement that former President Donald Trump withdrew the United States from. And I think that the brutality that the Iranian regime is showing towards peaceful demonstrators who are part of a younger generation, 80% of which is under the age of 40, makes Iran especially a rogue state. And adding to that problem, of course, is the training and the drones that Iran has sent to Crimea, which are now being used to attack indiscriminately Ukrainian cities with significant infrastructure destruction. 30% of the country's electric grid has been destroyed or damaged, and killing a lot of innocent civilians, including children in playgrounds, in the process. So this presents us with a very difficult situation. I think we're seeing other problems elsewhere, which I won't go into in great detail since we're focusing on Saudi Arabia. We also see Russia withdrawing some of its prime troops from Syria. So we could see in Syria more Iranian involvement, and that crisis take a more ominous direction, also drawing Israel in more closely. We see Lebanon really as a failed state, and Hezbollah being the most powerful force in the state with its close ties to Iran. On the other hand, Hezbollah really doesn't seem to have any kind of program for dealing with the crisis that Lebanon is facing. So on the one hand, we have a Saudi leader who is really not following the norms of the international community. It's true that before he took the rule in the country, there were significant human rights abuses. For example, Raif Badawi, who was flogged and put in jail simply for having published a blog. And now we see Salim al-Mahdi, who is a Saudi American, who is 72, has been sentenced to 16 years for tweets that he published over the last 5 or 6 years, and then an additional 15 years not being able to travel, which means that he would be 104 before he could leave Saudi Arabia and come back to the United States. The United States then, from my perspective, and I think this is the important issue, has to adopt a new bipartisan foreign policy. And that foreign policy has to be made explicit to the American people. Why is it important that there be a bipartisan policy? It also means that we need to move much more quickly to renewable energies, so we're not as dependent on countries like Saudi Arabia, who provide us with hydrocarbon wealth. But clearly, the days of the United States running solo, as it were, are over. There has to be a consensus in which the United States, the European Union, Australia, Canada, the NATO powers, the ASEAN powers have to be brought into a situation where we can make sure that on the one hand, our material needs are met, and that in this case, that's oil, but at the same time, actions that contravene human rights, as in Saudi Arabia and some of the Gulf states also, unfortunately, and Iran, to make sure that Iran continues to be sanctioned in a way that will not allow it to develop more weaponry, which it can use. Now we see being used outside the Middle East, but also potentially against Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, and to prop up regimes in Syria and help strengthen the Hezbollah in Lebanon. The other factor that has to be brought into the mix is that one of the reactions of MBS to American criticisms of his policies has been developing a new policy which brings Saudi Arabia closer to China. This is also quite disturbing. China is not the economic power that it was before the beginning of COVID. So its Belt and Road Initiative is not as robust as it once was. But we do see that China has used this Belt and Road Initiative in the many countries to which it has given assistance to manipulate these countries and to put them in a debt position. Obviously, that would not be the case in Saudi Arabia, since Saudi Arabia has a large sovereign wealth fund, as do the Arab Gulf states. But at the same time, if China begins to take the place of the West as a supplier of weaponry and begins to expand its efforts to develop bases, which it tried to do in the UAE and the Gulf, and at the same time is giving greater support to Iran, that only adds to a highly combustible situation. So we need a lot of good minds. We need people who can really think about new strategies, try to work on convincing MBS that he's got to move in a different direction, use the Arab Gulf states to pressure him to do that, along with our other democratic partners in Europe and elsewhere. And unfortunately, much of this cannot just be done behind the scenes. There have to be some public salvos. They don't have to go into a lot of detail, but President Biden does need to come out and talk about those consequences that he threatened when MBS, against the wishes of the West, which is experiencing a high inflation problem, increased the price of oil by reducing Saudi oil production, which of course helps Vladimir Putin, because as oil prices go up, oil is the key mechanism that he uses to fund this highly destructive war. And now let's remember that there's even been talk by the Russian ambassador to the UN of perhaps closing down Ukrainian grain imports, which have already had a very, very damaging effect on Egypt, on Tunisia, and other MENA region states. So this could lead to more internal instability. So Saudi Arabia is really a fulcrum, I would argue, of multiple issues. It has to be looked at from multiple directions. But just to remain silent and allow MBS to continue to function in the way that he has to date, I think will only embolden him to engage in even more problematic initiatives in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Davis. If we can, if you give me a minute, I'll just see if Abramo is on the call with us. Abramo, if you're there, hopefully he will join us. Dr. Al-Lumadi, please, off to you.
Good afternoon, or I don't know, good evenings. I don't know where everybody is. I'm in New York. I'm a professor at CUNY, and my interest in Saudi Arabia started a long time ago, and it kind of intensified after the after MBS, Mohammed bin Salman came to power, or came to be the crown prince, the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia. And I have always said that Mohammed bin Salman is a danger to himself, a danger to Saudi Arabia, a danger to the Middle East in general. He has taken dangerous decisions that really a political player wouldn't take. The invasion of Yemen, despite the justifiable necessity of getting in there because of the Iranian influence, I thought was a really reckless decision to plunge Saudi Arabia into that war. The situation with Qatar, I thought, was uncalled for, and it was probably an expression of personal vendetta with the Emiratis, or because of Al Jazeera and how Al Jazeera reported. I thought his decision to imprison the Prime Minister of Lebanon was out of control and completely reckless. He imprisoned him, and some reports indicated that he might have attacked him, like physically, or he was attacked physically while in custody. And of course, the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, I thought, was outrageous and really spoke volumes about this man's mindset and how dangerous he could be to himself, to the Saudi people, and to the region. We are really looking at someone who, and his latest decision to side with Russia is just a continuation of a man who's really not a political player, who doesn't understand the role of Saudi Arabia and how it has maintained itself, kept itself away from trouble. So I believe that we haven't heard the last of MBS, and I still believe that the United States and the Europeans underestimate what MBS is capable of doing. The closest I can think of in the Arab world is the alliance with Saddam Hussein, the Western alliance with Saddam Hussein, which we all know how it turned out to be. He was America's favorite Middle Eastern dictator, and he was supported by Saudi Arabia itself. And then Saddam is probably responsible for what has happened in the Middle East, and how Iran managed to take over the Middle East, of course, helped by American foreign policy makers who didn't understand the dynamics in the Middle East. Now, why does Mohammed bin Salman do all of this? I think it's really easy to understand. The man is in charge of a country, and he doesn't have an ideology. The ideology is power, is control. And if you lack an ideology, then you don't really have any support, any ideological support from your own people. You can't say that Mohammed bin Salman is an Islamist. He's definitely afraid of the Muslim Brotherhood, and he's no friend of the Salafis. I'm sure he's definitely not on that camp. You can't say Mohammed bin Salman is a liberal who's trying to modernize Saudi Arabia and bring human rights. That's definitely not him. So if he's not a liberal, and if he's not an extremist, so what is he? Actually, he's none of that. He's someone who wants to become the king of Saudi Arabia, and he understands that to do that, you will need force, because that is how the Saudi rulers have ruled. They don't have an ideology. There was a time when they had an ally with the most extreme in Saudi Arabia, and those are the Wahhabis. However, Mohammed bin Salman decided that that alliance had to stop and had to be ended, because it's not working for him. It's not working for the regime. So this is a man who is attacking everybody. He's attacking his own people, and we have seen with our own eyes and with evidence what he did to Jamal Khashoggi. We have seen how he still he targeted Saudis abroad, like Al-Jabari. We know that he's targeting all kinds of Saudis in Saudi Arabia. He is jailing. He's jailing Muslim clerics. He is jailing women. He's jailing activists. He's jailing immigrant workers, immigrant activists. So you're looking at a man who's on the attack against everybody, and you can discern an ideology that this man has other than what I described as the desire and the need, I would say, to stay in power, but without committing to any ideology, because he doesn't have any ideology, and because being unpredictable is actually a tactic of remaining in power. Therefore, when you look at some of the things that Mohammed bin Salman has been doing internally, the only thing that you can discern as some type of like philosophy to rule Saudi Arabia is this unexplainable desire to modernize Saudi Arabia and make these and create these cities where you can live in the 21st century with technology and jobs and all of this. However, he's oblivious to the plight of the Saudis. So on the one hand, he wants to modernize Saudi Arabia. On the other hand, he doesn't want to modernize the political system, the social system. He doesn't want the Saudis to live in any type of freedom. So this is really, this is the ideology this man has, which is a promise to modernize Saudi Arabia and to make it a technology-based culture without any attention to human rights or modernizing the institutions, as if the country, in his mind, is just a place where you find a job, but you don't necessarily need freedom of expression. You don't need institutions that will bring Saudi Arabia and the Saudi people into modernity in terms of society and civil society. My guess is that he's using that push to modernize. He's using it as a way to get all of these Western companies to come and make a lot of money. And they are making a lot of money from his Neom city, and they're happy with the money that they're making. And there are doubts as to whether the city will even become a city one day. We're talking about billions of dollars being spent, huge contracts for US and European-based companies. And the Washington Post published an article about 15 US retired generals working in Saudi Arabia, and I guess making fat salaries. So Mohammed bin Salman has managed to wrest control of this country, to remove his cousins from the scene. He has given the West what they want, which is a huge contracts. And the American foreign policy seemed to think, and Westerners in general, Western governments seem to think that somehow they can control Mohammed bin Salman. Yes, he can oppress his people. Yes, he can probably side with Putin here and there. Yet we can control him somehow. And I'm here to say that they are wrong, just as they were wrong about Saddam Hussein, and how that conflict between Saddam Hussein and the West actually led to the Iranians infiltrating the Middle East and challenging the West in the Middle East today. Finally, I think Mohammed bin Salman I acknowledge that this is he's a serious challenge. On the one hand, you don't want to break him because he does control a very important country. He does control a lot of oil, but at the same time, you want to hold him responsible for his craziness inside Saudi Arabia and now outside Saudi Arabia, aligning himself with Russia and aligning himself with China. So I think the West is facing a serious challenge, and I don't claim that I have answers, but all I want to end by saying that every time these Western governments and my own government here in the US, every time they sided with Arab dictators, things turned out to be really bad for both the Middle East and for America. And an example of this, the jihadis in Afghanistan, whom the Saudis sent to Afghanistan to fight the Soviets, they turned out to be the biggest threat to the US. Another example is Saddam Hussein, whom everybody tolerated because he was fighting Iran. And what happened, we know the result. The result is that Iran is controlling 4 countries and threatening Israel and threatening the Arab world. And finally, I think the same thinking is still, the same mistake is being made with Mohammed bin Salman. I really think he is very dangerous and we haven't seen the last of him. And I'm afraid he is a true threat to Saudi Arabia, to the Arab world, to the Middle East, and to the world if he's not stopped. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Al-Umari. Much appreciated. Emiliano, so glad you can join us. Would you be able to speak next, do you think?
If it's possible, I would like to speak in Italian language.
In Italian?
Yes, if it's possible.
I'm not sure if we have an Italian to English translator on the call with us.
Okay, so if you put, I wait another speech and after speaking English.
Great, many thanks. In that case, Adam Shapiro, after you.
Hi. Following up on the points that have been raised so far, obviously, as has already been mentioned, the killing of Jamal Khashoggi was both an outrage, of course, but also an indication of the kind of person that we're dealing with here in terms of Mohammed bin Salman. But before we get to talking about justice and what that might look like and how to pursue it and what's being done in the case of Jamal Khashoggi, which is what I'll address, I think it's also worth noting, even with this, given that he's the current ruler, effectively, of Saudi Arabia, that it is still worth understanding and acknowledging that in terms of arbitrary detention, the imprisonment of dissidents and human rights defenders and others in Saudi Arabia, this has a long history, and MBS didn't invent this. Some of the new sentences that have been handed down, which I think my colleague might address, are certainly headline grabbing and shocking in a lot of ways. But there, even as some of the cases that have been mentioned before of human rights defenders and activists who've been imprisoned, many of those happened prior to MBS coming to power. And so that this is a feature of Saudi Arabia and the ruling family, effectively, as to how they have dealt with and addressed concerns and by their own population, how they've dealt with their own population over time. And so we can understand the killing of Jamal Khashoggi in that context, as well as we could also understand it as the action by effectively, I'm not a professional analyst here, but the way in which Jamal Khashoggi was killed certainly would suggest that the person behind who imagined such an outcome is perhaps a psychopath. or a sociopath. And so when making comparisons to other authoritarian rulers in the region, as Dr. Nasir pointed out about Saddam, I'm actually more often thinking of another analogy, which is that of the former Libyan authoritarian ruler Muammar Gaddafi. And I think maybe MBS kind of straddles a little bit of both examples in a lot of ways, both in terms of his own megalomania, but also in terms of how the West has dealt with those prior to rulers. In terms of pursuing justice for Jamal, and in this case, I'll speak to what's ongoing and what potentially is still out there. There is a civil case in the United States brought by my organization and Dr. Abdullah's organization, Dawn, along with the fiancée of Jamal, Hatija, in a United States civil court, so not a criminal court, a civil court, making a civil case. And we have identified MBS as the culprit, as the perpetrator. And where that is right now, and what is now becoming a very interesting moment, is that the court has referred to the US State Department to question whether or not this case can proceed from the State Department's position as to whether or not MBS is the head of state. There is a head of state immunity in US law, which would prevent effectively this case from going forward. And when the judge in the case brought that question to the State Department, this was prior to President Biden's trip last summer, in the summertime, to the region. And so the State Department asked for a delay, largely because it didn't want to impede on the diplomatic trip that President Biden was making to the region. Since then, two things have happened, which maybe change what the considerations are of the United States. One is, of course, as has been mentioned, the manipulation of the oil production such that it is a counter to US interests and certainly to President Biden's interests in the context of domestic US elections, et cetera. But also, MBS was named as prime minister in a royal decree, seemingly in violation of Saudi law, which specifies who is the prime minister, and it does leave a little bit of question as to whether or not the king has the authority to appoint the crown prince or anybody else as prime minister. But the king, as long as the king is alive, and this king still is meant to be the prime minister according to Saudi law. Yet MBS has been named the prime minister, seemingly in an attempt to head off this civil lawsuit. So we shouldn't dismiss the civil lawsuit just because it's civil and not criminal, and we shouldn't dismiss it. Obviously, it's a concern to the Saudi ruler and the de facto ruler, and now the State Department has to weigh in on this. What seemingly at the time, perhaps was going to be the expected outcome, which was the State Department granting him recognition as head of state, now seems to be in doubt and question, especially now that we have senators and congresspeople in the United States, as well as people in the administration itself, fundamentally questioning the entire US-Saudi relationship at this point. And there have been some really unprecedented statements made by some key senior senators, especially about effectively terminating the status quo of the US-Saudi relationship and redoing it, seemingly according to some of the ideas that Professor Davis mentioned about setting up a new US foreign policy. Not that grand yet, but certainly along those lines. The second way that Dawn has tried to go after accountability in this case is with a criminal case, a criminal complaint. And this is in France. This summer, just after the Biden trip to the region, MBS headed to France for meetings with the French president. And because he was on French soil, that opened the door for the filing of a criminal complaint against MBS, according to the French law, which includes universal jurisdiction. And so the crime of enforced disappearance, of torture, and effectively of murder, those crimes can be brought into the French legal system according to France's legal code of the fact that it has universal jurisdiction for such crimes. And given that MBS was on French soil, that enabled us to not only file the case, but that for French investigators to actually take up and pursue. That's in progress at this point. It didn't matter that MBS subsequently left the territory. That has been filed, it is valid, and the French legal system has to deal with it. Of course, we know that the French political side of things has extraordinary interest in Saudi Arabia. It is one of Saudi's largest arms suppliers at this point, and French companies, much as American companies, are rushing to do business with MBS. So there is considerable political and economic reasons to think that this case could potentially be dropped, but France also has a reputation, and the reputation is proud of in terms of its own legal system, and the fact that it offers universal jurisdiction, that it is was a leader on the UN Convention against enforced disappearance, and is very proud of its stance in that regard. So it is still a question as to what's going to happen with that. That said, there are other countries that also offer universal jurisdiction, and in some ways, one of the most important things that we accomplished by filing the lawsuit in France was to signal to MBS that he doesn't get a free pass when he wants to travel around the world. Everywhere he goes, he can expect that there's going to be the filing of a case in places where there is universal jurisdiction against him for the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. And this is one way we're going to keep up the fight for justice in his case. Looking at a little bit broader picture, this question of impunity in the killing of journalists and the killing of human rights defenders, and in this case, we have Jamal Khashoggi, who also had a connection to the United States as he was a resident here in the US, begs a question to the United States in terms of impunity and these issues. And in this region, we also have another notorious case now of another journalist, Shireen Abu Akleh, who is a Palestinian-American journalist who was killed by Israeli forces. In both cases, we are seeing the United States take a position, despite having overwhelming evidence pointing to who the perpetrators are and that there could be accountability. We see the United States government deflecting, or in the case of Shireen, actively working to defend the Israeli government. This is not a sustainable policy as part of the U.S. approach to the region or to the world. And of course, we see a flat-out hypocrisy when it comes to the case of Ukraine, where quite the opposite. We see all sorts of support by the United States government for the Ukrainian government to pursue war crimes cases. Even the United States government talking about using the International Criminal Court, which is itself a bit of whiplash, given that the US refuses to sign on to the Rome Statute and to join the International Criminal Court. So this is increasingly, as there's more and more awareness, as there's more and more organization by civil society, by human rights activists, and including by journalists, to push on accountability issues, that the United States is, in particular, but this I think goes for other Western countries too, are walking a path of double standards, of hypocrisy, etc., that isn't satisfying, causes of justice, but also isn't satisfying American national security or foreign policy interests anymore. And whereas in previous days, in decades ago, where the United States could support authoritarian, and Western countries could support authoritarian rulers despite what they do to their own populations, that policy, I think, is the days for that policy to survive, that kind of approach to foreign policy, as Professor Davis has mentioned, are coming to an end. And we as civil society, we as empowered and connected members of a global civil society need to keep up our pressure and need to keep up our work in order to give voice to the voiceless in a lot of ways, but also hold our governments greater to account for this kind of duplicity that they have, in some ways being accomplices to these gruesome murders and to the policies that are imprisoning dissidents, human rights defenders, journalists in these kinds of countries. With that, I will conclude and turn it to my colleague.
Thanks so much, Adam. Appreciate it. Liliane, are you? Would you like to speak now, or do you have? Would you like a little more time?
You're muted.
Sorry, okay, ready.
After
Okay.
please.
Okay, thank you. I'm really happy for this webinar to speak with you and to listen to you. So, Saudi Arabia continues to be one of the special observed nations of the human rights front. This nation is trying to fill some gaps. It has failed to raise its label as one of the most repressive countries in the Gulf and in the world. So, 2020, 21, 22 was some years still black years for freedom, democracy, rights in this country. The list of violations committed by the kingdom is long, from the military campaign against the rebel group in Yemen, Houthi, with illegal airstrikes that killed and injured some of the part of civilians population, to the arbitrary detention of dissidents, independent human and religious rights activists, to trial without any defense and with the use of the torture against these people, accused of peaceful activism and dissident, up to the treatment of women, still far from a craving for respect for human dignity. So I think that we have a really important problems with the migrants. For example, in Italy, in Sicily, where I stay now, I listen many people from Eritrea, from Yemen, that speak about the condition that some of them found try in Saudi Arabia. Without neglecting the complex story of the killing of the journalist Jamal Khashoggi in 2018, for which a sham trial took place without any transparency and with puppet sentences against lower grade agents with prison sentences of 7-10 years to cover well implications. In this bleak setting on the monarchy, made up more of shadows than of lights, the world of work is no exception, and analysts of the rules and rights applied to the employed in the kingdom, in fact, shows how much workers are comparable to real slaves, total absence of guarantees, physical abuse, no payment of salaries, exploitation for hours and duties, denial of freedom of movement are among the most widespread violation against the labor force employed in Saudi Arabia and formed above all by migrants. For this reason, in these days, in Italy, we are speaking so much about this condition, and with Pietro Bartolo, an important European parliamentary, we are speaking, we are studying so much this condition, and I think that the Commission of European Parliament have to speak about this for a new resolution in the next future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emiliano. And our last speaker now, Abdullah Al-Ouda, I believe, yeah, well, you have the floor after you.
Thank you so much, Joe. I'm glad to be part of this panel, and just to listen to Adam, Nasser, and Eric and Emiliano about the Saudi justice system. I remember, like in 2011, when Arab Spring erupted and neighboring countries were calling for the overthrow of regimes. We in Saudi Arabia, activists, academics, people of, who, were a bit vocal at the time, were asking for the application of the law. And it was kind of ironic that when neighboring countries were saying in Arabic, for example, "Isqat al-nizam," we were talking about "tatbiq al-nizam." It's kind of ironic that people in Saudi Arabia at that time saying that even the Saudi government itself is not applying the law that itself enacted, and they were specifically referring to the law of criminal procedure at the time, which is a law that at least protected some basic rights and gave some protection for privacy, let's say, against search without warrant, against arbitrary detention for lengthy times. And the government realized that it was at a place where they kind of limit their own powers in trying to just willy-nilly arrest people and not give them any basic rights. So they in 2013, 14, and 15 created another path of saying, well, if you guys wanted us to apply the law, well, guess what? We are going to apply the law, but we are going to enact another law. And then they enacted the law, the counterterrorism law and the anti-cybercrime law, which was designed actually not to try terrorists, but rather activists, peaceful activists, public human rights defenders, even women human rights defenders. Article 31 of the law says basically questioning the king or the crown prince is an act of terrorism in Saudi Arabia. Another law says, for example, protesting on the street of Saudi Arabia is an act of terrorism. The anti-cybercrime law saying possessing or producing any material that is critical to the foreign policy of the kingdom is considered a crime. So basically, they enacted this law, and then in order to facilitate the trial of these kind of crimes, quote, they created the counter-terrorism courts called specialized criminal courts in Saudi Arabia. And these specialized criminal courts, they actually also designed, the judges were specifically chosen for these kind of courts to facilitate what otherwise was arbitrary detention, and to facilitate and to basically legalize what otherwise was illegal according to the criminal procedures of Saudi Arabia. And so this was all pre-Mohammed bin Salman. So this is just to the point that Adam mentioned, which is like the system, the mechanisms was there. What Mohammed bin Salman did is that he actually brought it to another level. So post 2015, when King Salman came to power, Mohammed bin Salman kept rising to the ranks. And basically, July 2017, when he became fully crown prince, he was unchecked, completely absolute power. He had all he wanted. He has all he wanted, and therefore he unleashed all these policies of his, including like the bringing the Yemen war into another disastrous level, and pushing toward more perpetual at that time war in Yemen, blockade in the neighboring country, Qatar, what happened with Lebanese, as my colleagues mentioned. And also, for me, more importantly, how he dealt with citizens inside. In September 2017, he, started the first wave of arrest when he arrested the most prominent scholars, economists, poets, you name it, of the Saudi society. It was like a huge crackdown on people. And then another wave of crackdown took place just in October, when he tried to, quote unquote, cleanse the judicial system by arresting a few judges and many staff of the Ministry of Justice and prosecutors, in order to appoint loyalists who will basically facilitate this brutal treatment of activists and peaceful human rights defenders. And then in November, of course, the most famous one is the Ritz-Carlton, when he locked up a businessman and businesswoman and let no one fool you and call it anti-corruption purge, because it has nothing to do with corruption. It was just shaking up the most, of course, there are many corrupt people among them, but the most corrupt one is those who are actually orchestrating this operation, Mohammed bin Salman himself and the gang around him. And then, of course, the wave against feminists and most, prominent activists in March, and then later May, arresting Lujayna al-Hidlul and others. And it kept on going, like all these waves of arrest, and never stopped, because this paranoia against his own citizens, is still there, because I think really he's a psychopath who really has no limits. We have reports of people who actually died under torture in Saudi Arabia by the same team that actually killed Jamal Khashoggi, the Tiger team. Salman al-Dawish was tortured, according to multiple reports, to death. And at one point, he was physically tortured by MBS himself. This is the only case that I know that MBS was personally involved in a case where he physically tortured people. So you get cases like that, but it did not get enough attention because it was not kind of an international crime that will bring this, uproar that the Jamal Khashoggi operation did. So these are the cases before Biden's visits, and I want to say this: like when Mohammed bin Salman uses these visits of high-profile politicians like the UK and the president of the US to justify not just his own ruling, but actually his behavior and his violations, locally, at home and abroad. And when the former UK Prime Minister, the former UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson visited Riyadh a couple of months ago, Mohammed bin Salman used actually this visit to execute 81 people on one day. It's an unprecedented level, unprecedented mass execution in the history of the Arabian Peninsula that took place on one day. And this happened while Boris Johnson was in Riyadh. So MBS uses these visits, and I want to end with what happened after Biden's visit. And we have been warning, the Biden admin. We have been talking to everybody, to the media, and they have been fully aware. We talked to the National Security Council. I've been talking to the State Department, to the admin, directly, indirectly. We sent them memo. We told them that, this visit is going to make it much worse for the Saudis and for the US. And now everything that happened and took place just proves our points. that MBS, even oil-wise, let alone like human rights and basic liberties that we care about. So after the Biden's visit, you get cases that Eric mentioned, which is like the cases against people who were sentenced to 50 years in prison, 70 years in prison. We get two human rights defenders, female human rights defenders, who were actually sentenced to 45 and 34, and they were young and and well educated. And we get cases where people were actually sentenced to death because they refused to leave home because their homes were part of the places where MBS wanted to make room for the NEOM project. So this is completely proof in what we have been saying, that it's all MBS. This is his behavior, his mentality. He will never change. But actually, every international visit, every international delegation will just give him more protection, more legitimacy to get more brutal and more raw. I'm thinking that, well, yes, if Saudi Arabia is important to the US, well, MBS is never Saudi Arabia. MBS is winning over when we think that, dealing with Saudi Arabia, dealing with sources, dealing with how important the Arabian Peninsula is, means that we have to deal with MBS. Well, that's not true. MBS kind of pushed for this narrative for him to be equated to Saudi Arabia and the Arabian Peninsula, because more importantly, I think when you look at the Arabian Peninsula and Saudi Arabia, you should think about the Saudi people, the Saudi institution, the civil society, the educated people, people who are in jail, abroad. It's a very vibrant society, as well as Iran society is vibrant, and we deserve the Saudi people to be supported, as well as the Iranian people are by the admin and being met and cheered by politicians here in Washington D.C. I'm just going to end here.
Thank you very much, Abdullah. I did mean to ask very briefly, and of course, no pressure, if you could just give us an update on your father, who I understand is detained in the kingdom, and again.
Yes, of course. Yeah, no worries at all. So yes, so my father, Salman al-Oda, when I mentioned the first arrest, he was actually first wave of arrest in 2017. He was the first person to be arrested in that way. So he was one of the few, if not the first person to be arrested by Mohammed bin Salman himself in 2019, given his prominence and how high profile he is. So he was arrested in September 2017. The charges were brought against him, 37 charges, including like corrupting earth, calling the Saudi monarchy a tyrannical system. One charge, believe it or not, is mocking the government achievements. Another charge is having books that are banned in the kingdom. And it goes on and on. It's just silly charges, and their trial started on September 4th, 2018. And nothing new. Like, he hasn't been even sentenced. The trial has been suspended for more than 1 year and a half now, with no new development whatsoever, and it's just up in the air. Visitations have been really difficult now. Phone calls has been completely stopped. His health has dramatically actually deteriorated. He lost half of his vision, half of his hearing because of the solitary confinement, because of the mistreatment. 19 members of my family are banned from traveling just to retaliate against my father and against me for speaking out, outside. So, and my uncle Khalid was actually sentenced to 8 years in prison because he tweeted about my father. He said he confirmed the news about my father when he was arrested in 2017. He's still in jail for more than 5 years later. It's just crazy. My cousin was also arrested, so you got this kind of level of retaliation and absurd brutality against my family and me.
Well, I'm really sorry to hear that, and on behalf of the AOHR UK, solidarity to the Al Aouda family. Thank you. We do have a few minutes now. If any of the speakers or any of the audience would like to ask any questions, as it happens, I have one myself for Professor Davis. You mentioned some support amongst the youth for MBS. And I was, if I heard you right, I was wondering if you could elaborate on the nature of that support. Of course, there's repression, as we've heard. Of course, there is a state that's very generous, not least to the obviously very large royal family. But I was wondering if that support you mentioned had a, so to speak, positive aspect. If people perhaps even thought that political freedoms weren't worth a loss of, it might be kind of state power, revenues of some kind. Is there simply something like a kind of cynical silence and an enjoyment of, a materially very wealthy country in parts?
Well, I think that the reason that he's made these what we could call reforms are really to use them against the traditional forces like the ulama, the Wahhabiyin, as he tries to push Saudi Arabia more towards his vision of modernization, which of course has no dimension of political freedoms or liberalism as any of us, the panelists, understand it. But I think that many of the youth at the same time were initially enamored by what he was doing. But now where we begin to see that there are certain economic constraints, jobs are not as available as they once were, the kind of carte blanche, cradle to grave support, free college tuition, being able to go abroad and study. This has also been restricted. So I think that while it's difficult to do public opinion polls within Saudi Arabia, and perhaps Abdullah would have some thoughts on this, much better than me, of course, is that some of that sheen is worn off, because at the same time, the same people who realize they are gaining freedom to go to restaurants or see worldwide wrestling matches, at the same time are losing many other freedoms and facing a kind of Xi Jinping regime. You've got to work hard and you've got to work for the leader and you have to be totally obedient. And if you're not, you're going to be banished from the kingdom and worse, perhaps put in jail, perhaps tortured, perhaps even killed. And I think, of course, when we talk about youth, we're talking about educated youth, the youth that MBS needs for his Vision 2030. This is not affecting the large number of youth because we know Saudi Arabia has about a 25% poverty rate. So many youth here are not even affected by this policy. We're really talking about a small percentage of the population at the very top. But again, it is a society like many, like in Iraq, 70% of the population is under age 30. That's 28 out of 41 million. Think about that. And that's true for many other MENA region states. So something is going to have to be done, as we're seeing the youth in Iran rejecting the septuagenarian and octogenarian leadership and demanding a new political system be created. And I'm sure to MBS, that's a very frightening scenario.
Thank you very much for that answer. And if we have any more questions, please just interject or perhaps raise your hand. And if not, it's getting towards evening here in London. And I'll, on behalf of the organisation, just thank all the speakers. I really learned a lot from this evening's discussion, and I believe there will be a report of it appearing tomorrow, which I'm sure you'll all be sent.
Thank you.
Thank you all again.
Thank you so much.
Good evening.